In 1953, 2,500 people were moved out of Ciudad Guerrero so that Falcon Dam could drown it. They were told it was permanent. 73 years later, the streets are walkable. The cobblestones are intact. The flagstones in the town square have not moved. Falcon Reservoir fell to 8.6% of capacity in May of 2024, the lowest reading since the dam was finished in 1954. Even after storms dumped 232,000 acre-feet into the system this July, the lake is still holding less than half of what the engineers built it to hold. It gave the city back and never took it again. The town was 248 years old when the water came for it. There was a stone basilica, an open-air market, a customs house, a boys' school, a two-story hotel. All of it went under 10 to 12 feet of reservoir. The lake that covered it once spread across 138 square miles. In the worst of the dry years, it covered 28. The shoreline today sits more than 2 miles from the plaza. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The water did come back, more than once. Local accounts describe tropical systems in 2010, pushing the reservoir back over the low ground near the site. This July, rain put more water into the Rio Grande in 7 days than the valley had seen in years, and Falcon climbed from roughly 20% to about 37%, and the plaza stayed dry. The reservoir is not empty. It has lost the ability to reach that high. The thing that made Ciudad Guerrero worth building was the same thing that killed it. It sat on the bank of the Rio Grande, on the Mexican side, where the river bent and the crossings were shallow, and the water never stopped. Ranchers came there to buy and sell, to marry, to baptize their children. That position was the whole reason for the town. It was also the reason the engineers picked the spot. The town was founded in 1750 by Spanish royal decree, part of the settlement of the lower Rio Grande. José de Escandón, the Spanish military officer who colonized the region, drew a map of the area around 1747 that put the river dead center, the way a map of London puts the Thames dead center. Guerrero is not labeled on it yet. The word written across that stretch of ground is simply ranchos. The buildings that went up over the next 2 centuries were made of a sandstone quarried nearby, not brick, not adobe. Stone blocks, some of them weighing up to 300 pounds, set with mortar. That detail is going to matter later. The streets between them were cobbled by hand. According to the town archivist, the children who laid those stones were working off their misdeeds. Whether that is history or town legend, the cobbles are still there, and they are still level. At the center was a plaza with diagonal walkways running out from a concrete bandstand, 8 large benches set around it, and the arcaded stone market running along one side, second in prominence only to the church. By the middle of the 20th century, the town had a basilica called Nuestra Señora del Refugio, a bell tower dated 1755, an arcaded market, a girls' school, a boys' school, a customs house, and a hotel. It had a bridge across the river to Zapata County, Texas. None of that survived the plan. Here is the timeline, and it moves fast once it starts. The idea for a dam on this stretch of the Rio Grande began around 1935, 6 miles east of where it was eventually built. The 2 countries approved the current site by treaty in the late 1940s. Work began in 1951. Deliberate impoundment started on August 25, 1953. That is the day the gates closed and the water started to rise. On October 19th of that same year, President Dwight Eisenhower of the United States and President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines of Mexico stood at the dam and dedicated it. The 5-mile embankment was finished on April 8, 1954. The first commercial power came out of the turbines on October 11, 1954. The Mexican government evacuated Ciudad Guerrero and gave the residents the chance to resettle. A new town went up next to the dam, 34 miles downriver, and it is still there. Nuevo Ciudad Guerrero. 2,500 people left. The bridge to Zapata County was erased from the map. The guardhouse, the basilica, the plaza, and the market went under. Somebody filmed it. The archivist of Nuevo Ciudad Guerrero, Maria del Carmen Gonzalez, who lived in the old town until she was 5 years old, keeps the footage of the inundation, along with the rest of the record. Photographs of the streets before the water. And later, a picture of the astronaut Neil Armstrong fishing on the reservoir that covered them. The water settled 10 to 12 feet deep over the low ground. It stayed there for 40 years. The Texas side lost towns too. Zapata was moved. So was the town of Falcon, named for Maria Rita de la Garza Falcon, whose family settled the North Bank around 1800. Their cemetery had to be relocated. The lake took the name of the town it displaced. Now pull back and look at what the two countries built. Falcon Dam sits about 40 miles southeast of Laredo, in Zapata and Star counties on the Texas side, and Nuevo Ciudad Guerrero on the Mexican side. The embankment runs 5 miles. The dam stands 150 feet above the riverbed. Full pool is 301.2 feet above sea level. At that line, the reservoir holds 2,666,203 acre-feet of water. That is the line the town needs the water to reach, and it has not been near it in 30 years. Under the Water Treaty of 1944, the United States owns 58.6% of that storage. Mexico owns 41.4%. Downstream sits the Rio Grande Valley, where the water irrigates crops and supplies the cities along the river. 2 lakes, 1 river, 2 countries, and a set of numbers written down in 1944 that the river has struggled to honor ever since. Everything the 2 countries built here was designed to hold water. The basin it was built in stopped being able to deliver it. So, how does a reservoir this large lose the ability to reach a town on its own shoreline? Not by evaporating, by losing its bounce. A river basin used to work something like the spring on a screen door. Dry years pull it open, wet years snap it shut. The system takes a hit, absorbs it, and returns to where it started. That is not a figure of speech. It is something you can measure, and hydrologists have a name for it. Resilience. The capacity to refill in the wet years and endure the dry ones. Researchers at the University of California, Davis, studied the Rio Grande Basin and found that the spring is worn out. After roughly a century of damming and pumping, they concluded that a human-induced megadrought had fundamentally changed the basin, and that it had cost the river much of its resilience. The dry years still pull. The wet years no longer snap it back. That was the story anyone could see from the shore. A lake going down. The number underneath it was the inflow record. The International Boundary and Water Commission found that between 2011 and 2020, Amistad Reservoir received 33% less water flowing into it than it did between 1981 and 1990. In volume, that is roughly 4.6 million acre-feet of water that used to arrive and does not. That is not a typo, by the way. 4.6 million acre-feet. Missing from one reservoir in 1 decade. So rain does something different now than it used to. It comes hard, it runs off, it spikes the river, and the reservoir catches a fraction of it. In mid-July of this year, storms pushed the Rio Grande at Laredo toward a forecast crest of nearly 21 feet. The river normally runs under 5. The reservoirs gained 232,000 acre-feet in a week. They are still less than half full. The record lows tell the rest of the story, and there is a reason this stretch of river is still being talked about. In August of 2022, Falcon Reservoir sat at 9% full. Maria Elena Jenner, then Commissioner of the United States section of the International Boundary and Water Commission, said of the reservoir, "It's reached its historic low." The 2 most populous counties in the valley issued disaster declarations. Towns were extending intakes and installing backup pumps to reach what was left. That was only round 1. Then 2024 beat it. On May 15th, the water at Falcon stood at 255 feet above sea level. A month before that, it had been 266, 11 feet, gone in 30 days. Zapata County Judge Joe Rathmel said the drop followed water being released to farmers on the Mexican side of the river for new irrigation. That was the part that made people angry, and it was not the lake level. The next day, Falcon was holding 8.6% of total capacity, with the surface sitting nearly 47 feet below full pool. By the end of that summer, the National Weather Service office in Brownsville recorded the combined level of Amistad and Falcon as the lowest in the entire history of both dams. Nothing in the record was worse. Then the line turned. Falcon was near 11.5% in late 2025, around 18% in January of 2026, and 20.6% by early March. In February, the State Department announced an agreement with Mexico for a minimum of 350,000 acre-feet of Rio Grande water per year. plus a plan to repay the deficit from the previous 5-year cycle. Then the July rain. Amistad to about 42%. Falcon to about 37%. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water crises, earth science events, and geography news as they happen with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. Enter Alberto Ceballos Sanchez. He is a master architect and historical preservation specialist, and in 2004, a nonprofit called Los Hijos y Amigos de Ciudad Guerrero hired him to start putting the drowned town back together. By then, the floodwaters had fully receded. He had stone to work with. Everything was in place. Nobody on that crew knew what the work was about to run into. He worked fast. Before the end of that year, he had finished the guardhouse and started on the 1755 bell tower next to the basilica. He restored plaster and color inside the guardhouse, using what he knew about colonial indigo dye and the deep red of cochineal. He refused to use concrete. He calls concrete the cancer of historical buildings because it seals moisture inside stone and breeds mold. He used a lime and fine sand mortar that lets the walls breathe. To clean the caked mud off the stone, he used Zote, the pink bar soap sold in every market in Mexico, because bleach and pressure washing chew up sandstone. Then the work stopped. Less than a year in, cartel activity made the ruins too dangerous to reach. In April of 2010, a group of American fishermen on Falcon Lake reported being held at gunpoint and told not to come back. That September, a man named David Hartley was shot and killed while on a jet ski on the reservoir, according to his wife, who got away. His body was never recovered. The Mexican investigator assigned to the case was killed weeks later. Guerrero Viejo went off limits. Not for a season. Ceballos Sanchez would not stand inside those walls again for 22 years. He went back in April of 2026 at the request of the River Pierce Foundation, a nonprofit based in San Ignacio, Texas, a town of about 500 people, 50 miles north of Nuevo Ciudad Guerrero. He crossed into Tamaulipas against the advice of the United States State Department, with private security and a convoy that was stopped on the way by a Mexican military dispatch. 34 miles of rural highway, then a blue archaeology sign, then 45 minutes on a dirt road. What he found was a lesson in materials, not in water. The buildings closest to the river had been submerged the longest, but that is not what decided their fate. Where the original builders had used cheap plant-based mortar, the walls were rubble. Where they had used mineral-based mortar, the masonry held. That is the whole difference between a ruin and a pile. The two-story hotel is still standing, with prickly pear growing along the top of its walls. The boys' school, finished only a few years before the dam was announced and sitting on the lowest ground by the river, came through almost entirely intact because it was built with concrete and rebar, which, looking back, was either very bad timing or very bad information. The arcades of the open-air market are still there. So is the plaza. And in the walls of the oldest structures, on both banks, there are troneras, gun ports, narrow openings cut through the stone at chest height, built into a frontier that needed defending. The same feature turns up in the buildings the River Pierce Foundation owns across the river in San Ignacio, which is how a Texas nonprofit and a Mexican ghost town turned out to be the same story. Over one doorway in that Texas fort, there is a carving of 3 rosettes and 16 ovals. The foundation's board chair recognized it. She had seen what looked like the same pattern on Lamu Island, off the coast of Kenya. The reservoir's shoreline was nowhere in sight. Now, count outward from those walls, because this is where the numbers stop being about ruins. First, the ruins themselves. Guerrero Viejo is reachable, and it is unprotected. Heavy equipment for border wall construction has moved into view on the Texas side of this stretch of river. Preservationists at the River Pierce Foundation say they fear that the movement of machinery and the vibration from construction will damage the aged stone structures along the bank. Their buildings share sandstone, masonry, and gun ports in the walls with Guerrero Viejo. Joe Perez, the interim director of the foundation, argues that his buildings lose their meaning in isolation, that they only make sense in connection to the ranchos and the town across the river. Second, the lake towns. The tackle shops that served Falcon Lake now sit in the middle of brush country. Boat launch ramps end on dry ground with the water out of sight. 270 miles upriver at Amistad, the bait shops are stranded in the desert the same way. That was a recreation economy, built on a shoreline that moved. Third, the farms in the cities. When treaty deliveries from Mexico drop, Texas cuts allocations from Falcon and Amistad, and irrigation sits at the bottom of the legal priority list. Municipal water goes first. Farmers go last. Fourth, the treaty itself. Under the 1944 agreement, Mexico is expected to deliver a minimum of 1,750,000 acre-feet to the United States over each 5-year cycle. When Mexico falls behind, the shortfall lands in these two lakes. The same treaty that was written to guarantee the valley its water is the reason the argument now reaches the State Department. If you are wondering how one river ends up carrying that much legal weight, so is everyone who works on it. The valley has been at this edge before, and the last time is worth a close look. The water started leaving Falcon in the early 1990s. By 1998, the reservoir was 50 feet below its normal level. Galan Hansen, the Falcon Dam project manager, told a reporter that the lake had been that low only once before, in February of 1957, 4 years after the gates closed. That drought is what first pulled Guerrero Viejo out of the water. And in Gonzalez's collection, there is one photograph from those years that does the whole job by itself. The church bell tower, breaking the surface as the water pulled back. By 1995, the town was dry. Volunteers cleared mud out of the main plaza and found the diagonal walkways, the bandstand, and the 8 benches still set around it. The lake had shrunk from 138 square miles to 28, and the shoreline had retreated more than 2 miles. A Texas writer who walked the town in that period described watermarks about 8 feet up the walls of the houses, and the bell tower standing bleached white at the top, west of the plaza. Inside the church, on the floor, dozens of fishing lures. Fishermen had been steering their boats in through the doorway when the water was high, because a partial roof still gave them shade. People had been fishing inside the basilica. Now you can walk into it. If that had been the end of it, this would be a very different story. Julia Zamora, then 67 years old, and the only resident and unofficial mayor of the Old Town, put it plainly to a reporter in 1998. The water started to disappear in 1993, she said, and she did not expect it back. She was mostly right, and that is the part worth sitting with. In the 28 years since she said it, the reservoir has hit record lows twice, recovered twice, and never once climbed back over her plaza and stayed there. So the questions stack up. If 1998 was a drought, and 2022 was a historic low, and 2024 was worse than both, what is the word for a basin that sets a new record every few years? If 232,000 acre-feet of rain in a single week moves Falcon from 20% to 37%, how much rain would it take to reach 301.2 feet? And when did the last storm that size arrive? And if the wall goes up along the bank while the water stays down, what happens to a set of stone walls that have already survived 40 years underwater and 22 years of being unreachable? Nobody at the dam can answer that. The data does not say. Right now, in Tamaulipas, prickly pear is growing along the top wall of a hotel that was built before the dam was drawn. The flagstones of the plaza are dry and level. The bell tower from 1755 is standing in the sun, and the water that was supposed to cover all of it is 37% of the way back, sitting 2 miles out, in a basin that no longer snaps shut.